Last time we spoke about the First Jiangsu-Zhejiang War. The Anway-Juli War of 1920 saw the defeat of the Anway clique by the Juli and Fengtian cliques, reshaping territorial control. Despite their victory, stability remained nowhere to be seen in North China. Factionalism persisted, with alliances shifting and power struggles intensifying. Jang Zolin of the Fengtian clique emerged a significant player with Japanese backing, while Wu Peifu of the Juli clique earned fame as a military genius. Yet soon a rivalry emerged between the two leading figures, while they also tried to unify China. Meanwhile in the south, Dr. Sun Yat-sen's plan for the northern expedition faced numerous challenges amidst internal dissension and external pressure. In the end, Jang Zolin formed a grand coalition to defeat Wu Peifu, and it backfired spectacularly. Wu Peifu won the First Jiangsu-Zhejiang War, and now it would be him in the driver's seat in Beijing. This episode is the First Jiangsu-Zhejiang War. Well, hello there, and welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. Before I begin, I just wanted to remind you all, this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you go check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there, I just released a brand new series on the Japanese invasion of North China and Inner Mongolia. It's not too far apart from the history we're covering right now, and some of the actors, like Feng Yusung, are involved in it. Might be of interest to you. And if you don't fancy watching it as a visual form on YouTube, just go over to the Pacific War channel on any podcast platform, and there's a podcast version of basically all the episodes. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for what I'll tackle next. Wu Peifu, who had been born to poor parents in 1874, and he had earned the lowest degree in the traditional Qing examination system, he decided he would seek out a military career in the Beiyang army. By 1905, he became a junior officer in Cao Quan's 3rd Division. Wu Peifu had a traditional Confucian upbringing. He remained loyal to Cao Quan because of that special Confucian bond between mentor and student. He remained loyal despite Cao Quan's numerous failings, even when he threw his lot in with Jang Zolin to save his own ass, at Wu Peifu's expense. The Juli victory during the First Jiangsu-Zhejiang War emboldened Cao Quan's ambitions. He soon unleashed his henchmen all over Juli province, snatching up major positions. Cao Quan began a campaign of bribery and intimidation, something very reminiscent of the late Yuan Shikai. After his victory, Wu Peifu returned to Henan province, sending the newly appointed Inspector General of the Army, Feng Yusung, to Beijing. Those in Henan strongly petitioned against Feng Yusung's transfer, as he had gained an excellent reputation as a civil administrator in Henan. Where Wu Peifu went, it seemed banditry and extortion flourished. Yet Wu Peifu needed Feng Yusung to be in Beijing so he could re-establish his authority in his home base. As we had seen in the last episode, the Juli clique was not very sturdy. Unlike the Fengtian or even the Anway clique, the Juli clique was made up of a lot of riffraff, who only joined forces as a means to an end, notably to get rid of their enemies. Feng Yusung concentrated his army at Nanyuan, due south of the capital. He went to work checking fingernails, training his men in the good word of the Lord. Those men being a single division and 3 mixed brigades now. Feng Yusung had come a long way. Now, probably the most powerful warlord in Juli province, and he made sure to establish good relations with Cao Quan and his brother, Wang Huaiqing, the commander of the Beijing police. In June of 1923, Feng Yusung and Wang Huaiqing would jointly present their resignations to President Li Yuanhong, stating unless their men got paid, they could no longer be responsible for maintaining order around the capital. Yet the finances of China were in a terrible state. Chinese diplomats were struggling abroad to find foreign banks to loan money, and even they were not getting paid, so they were resigning en masse. Wu Peifu likewise was not receiving a single cent from the central government. After several days of a standoff, Li Yuanheng fled Beijing on June the 13th, taking the presidential seals with him, issuing orders countersigned by only a single other cabinet minister who had backed him, the Minister of Agriculture, and the Yunnan general, Li Kenyuan. It seems for Li Kenyuan it was a pretty bad call, for Cao Quan forced him out of office within just a few months. Cao Quan then bribed his way into office by October the 10th. It was an infamous bribery story. Apparently, Cao Quan bribed assembly members with 5,000 silver dollars each. This act was so egregious, it basically pissed off everybody. The hate tossed Cao Quan's way would help bolster Dr. Sun Yat-sen's continuous efforts in South China, basically saving his career. Cao Quan began his presidency proclaiming a constitution incorporating ideas of a federalist government, and then promoted Fang Yusung and other notable generals to the rank of marshal. While Cao Quan began consolidating his control in Zhuli, a very humiliated Jang Zolin would lick his tiger wounds and rebuild in the northeast. After rallying his troops back together once back in Manchuria, Jang Zolin quickly declared his 3 provinces in Manchuria to be independent from China. The Beijing government under Cao Quan had immediately gone to work trying to coerce defections amongst the Fangxian generals. Cao Quan tossed extravagant positions such as governorships to them, but only one notable general, Cao Shipin, took the bribe and he rebelled against Jang Zolin. Jang Zolin's loyal subordinate and great friend to the show, the dog-meat general Zhang Zongchang, easily defeated this defector. Now that Manchuria was independent, Jang Zolin firmly repressed any efforts of his provincial assemblies to create a civil government, or independence, of his military control. Thus, government positions in Manchuria remained in the hands of loyal Fangxian clique members. Because Jang Zolin was now very hostile to all in the Zhuli clique, relations with Dr. Sun Yat-sen improved. A bit of that age-old, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Thus, Jang Zolin began propagating the language of national unification, anti-imperialism, etc., all the buzzwords. Economically, Jang Zolin began developing railway lines, and he built a new port at Wulutao, both of which were competing with the Japanese-owned South Manchurian Railway Company and the port of Daoren. Jang Zolin knew full well most of China regarded him as a Japanese puppet. The Japanese, however, completely failed him during the First Jiangsu-Zhejiang War. Thus, he was trying to sport some backbone against them. Jang Zolin and his top commanders took their loss in 1922 to heart. He began a large-scale reorganization of his military. In 1922, his forces had been organized into 5 divisions, of which the 16th and 28th disintegrated. The 27th and 29th, along with a new reorganized 1st, were retained at the divisional level, while the rest of the troops formed into the 1st to 27th Mixed Brigades and the 1st to 5th Cavalry Brigades. He standardized his units. 150 men formed a company, 3 companies a battalion, 3 battalions a regiment, 3 regiments a brigade, at about 4,000 men strong. He reshuffled commanders, and he began promoting officers with professional education and less so banditry opium smoking types that he typically preferred in the past. He really made an effort to purchase new weaponry, and he expanded the output of the Mukden arsenal. During the warlord era, modern weaponry was expensive to come by. Those like the banditry types that made up the Fangxian clique used whatever they got their hands on. The Hanyang 88, based off of the German Gua 1888, had been the standard Qing rifle, and it was widely available. There was also a smaller quantity of Type 1 rifles, a Chinese knockoff of the Mauser Model 1907. Given Manchuria's proximity to Russia and Japan, rifles that found their way into Fangtian hands included the Russian Mosin Nagant 1891 and the Japanese Muratas and Arisakas of the 1897 and 1905 models. None of these were ideal. They were all pretty outdated. But in general, most of Chinese warlord armies were branding antiquated rifles. In 1922, the Mukden arsenal was capable of producing just a small amount of ammunition. Jang Zolin had also relied on piecemeal packages given to him, at first from Yuan Shikai, then Tuan Chire, and then the Japanese, on and off. Most of the supplies he got were Japanese-made. He had also managed to seize a lot from the Anway clique during the war in 1920. Something of great value he often seized were cars, By 1926, there were only something like 8,000 cars in all of China. It was a very hot commodity. French Renault FT tanks had been deployed to Vladivostok for the Allied intervention and the Siberian campaign. Many were sold to Jang Zolin in 1919. Jang Zolin would pour 17 million yuan into expanding the Mukden arsenal after his loss in 1922. He hired numerous foreign advisors to overlook the process. The Mukden arsenal ballooned to an operating budget of 1 million yuan a year, employing about 30,000 workers, including foreign specialists. The Fengtian would become China's largest arms importer, purchasing from Germany, Italy, France, and of course the majority coming from Japan. Type 3 heavy machine guns from Japan flooded in and 14 Renaults from France. The Fengtian began utilizing mines, barbed wire, armored trains, particularly Jangu-Jjang, and tanks when available. Jang Zolin purchased 4 new gunboats who became the nucleus of a naval force in the Gulf of Jili, and he began developing an air force. By 1923, he purchased 40 French Breguet aircraft that would be operated by 20 foreign pilots. He also looked to the future, at his son, Zhang Shuliang. By 1923, his army was nearly 200 men strong, certainly formidable, but ridden with issues. A year of intense training had greatly improved the Fengtian forces, but Jang Zolin was behind those like Dr. Sun Yat-sen, Wu Peifu, and even Feng Yusung in trying to infuse within the training a sort of ideology. Zhang Zolin also rose to further prominence during this time period. He had of course gained a lot of respect from Jang Zolin after quelling Cao Shipin. He began amassing a great fortune through extortion, violence, and opium dealing. Jang Zolin was still receiving assistance from the Japanese, despite not exactly aligning with their wishes. For Jang Zolin, tossing away some autonomy was merely a tactical move for his drive to conquer China. Thus it was a means to an end. For the Japanese, they sought an absolute hegemony over Manchuria. In August of 1923, Jang Zolin turned to Major General Hanju Shigeru, his Japanese advisor for Japanese arms, in anticipation for another war against the Zhuli clique. Hanju responded by denying him the request and criticized the Fengtian's army level of training and readiness. Then he basically went on to say that Japan would continue to support him as long as he did not invade China proper. The empire always demands that you exercise circumspection so that order may be maintained in the eastern provinces. Regardless of the Japanese position on the issue, Jang Zolin had taken enormous lengths to reorganize and retrain his army. To put it simply, he had grown far too strong and far too fast for the Zhuli clique to leave him alone. Yet the Tiger of Manchuria was not the only problem facing the Zhuli clique. There was also Dr. Sun Yat-sen's coalition in the south. There was a minor incident, a train robbery in Shandong province. It's always Shandong, isn't it? And it occurred in April of 1923. Several foreigners were kidnapped and ransomed. Alongside this, the feeling in the air was that a war was about to break at any moment. The foreigners wanted a stable China. The people of China wanted an end to all the wars. Thus, the foreign diplomats and Chinese officials began demanding the Zhuli and Fengtian cliques sign some sort of peace treaty before another war broke out. A peace agreement was reached in June of 1923, but in all honesty, what was a piece of paper during the Chinese warlord era? In the meantime, the Zhuli clique began focusing on the remnants of the Anway clique, who were now stuck in Fujian and Zhejiang province. In March of 1923, Zhuli clique member Sun Chuanfang was appointed military governor of Fujian. Sun Chuanfang was the former protege of the previous military governor of Hubei, Wang Chenyuan. And he, much like Feng Yusung, was becoming something of a rising star. Sun Chuanfang was being bolstered heavily by Cao Kun. Sun Chuanfang drove the Anway clique's military governor, Wang Yongchuan, out of Fuzhou. By early 1924, Fujian province was more or less firmly in Zhuli control. Wu Peifu intended to use Fujian as a springboard to conquer Guangdong. Meanwhile, the remaining Anway warlord, Liu Yangshang of Zhejiang province, was obviously panicking. Liu Yangshang held control over Zhejiang and also over Shanghai, including her arsenal, and extensive revenues from foreign trade, the opium trade, and had access to foreign markets. Rightfully fearing the Zhuli would come and crush him at any moment, He jumped into bed with Jang Zolin and Dr. Sun Yat-sen directly after the Anway clique's defeat back in 1920. Basically to garner their support and that of the foreigners, Liu Yongxiang began to publicly oppose Cao Quan when he bribed his way into the presidency. On November the 10th of 1923, the police chief of Shanghai and a Zhuli clique member, Xu Guoliang, was assassinated. It had been alleged Xu Guoliang was killed by henchmen of Liu Yongxiang. A battle emerged between Liu Yongxiang and the military governor of Jiangsu, Qi Shiyuan, over appointing a new successor. Now you might be asking yourself, why would two people be fighting over this issue? Isn't Shanghai under the jurisdiction of Jiangsu province? Yeah, funny thing about that, the city at the time was being administered by Liu Yongxiang as part of Zhejiang province. While historically Shanghai has typically been part of Jiangsu province, after the First Jiangsu-Zhejiang War, Liu Yongxiang seized control over the city and he basically became economically dependent on it. Both men began fighting this kind of political battle against each other, and they nearly began a war, but to preserve the peace they began negotiating and signing minor treaties. Both men agreed not to take any allies to fight another, and to not allow other warlords' armies to pass through each other's provinces, nor augment their current armies. But again, what does a piece of paper mean during China's warlord era? Despite everything, it was clear to Liu Yongxiang that Zhejiang was next on the chopping block for the Zhuli clique. Thus, in order to protect himself, he hired the Anway clique generals Zhang Xiping, the commander of the Fujian 2nd Division, and Yang Huajiao, the commander of the Fujian 3rd Division. Together, they were roughly 6,000 men strong. Obviously, their recruitment violated the peace treaty, and alongside this, Liu Yongxiang gave refuge to many Anway troops fleeing Fujian province. This basically handed the Zhuli clique justification to provoke a war. Meanwhile, Qi Shiyuan had expanded his military strength in preparation for seizing Shanghai. He began recruiting troops in Yanzhou and Jining. Initially within Jiangsu, Qi Shiyuan had 5 divisions and 6 brigades, roughly 43,000 men. Qi Shiyuan also had the support of naval commander Du Shigui, who led 20 warships with some marines. Qi Shiyuan also had a minor air force sporting some Vim bombers purchased from the United Kingdom. As for Zhejiang province, Liu Yongxiang reorganized the 2 Fujian divisions he recruited into a supplementary brigade and the 24th Mixed Brigade. These added to his own divisions and brigades brought his manpower to nearly 70,000 strong. Liu Yongxiang also had the support of the Shanghai-based fleet led by the Anway clique commander Lin Juanzhang and a small air force sporting French BR-14 fighter bombers. Now, Qi Shiyuan knew he had no chance in hell of capturing Zhejiang and Shanghai with his forces alone, so he went crying to Wu Peifu. Wu Peifu was, of course, looking down the barrel of a much larger war with Jang Zolin, and he had plans to garner Anway clique's support to his side in the future war. So in the meantime, he asked Qi Shiyuan to lay low and not to do anything rash. Thus, Qi Shiyuan did the very opposite. Qi Shiyuan held a secret military meeting in Nanjing, announcing to other warlords from Henan, Anhui, Hubei that he was going to invade Zhejiang province. They all wanted a piece of the pie, so the game was on. Qi Shiyuan appointed himself commander-in-chief and he created 3 route armies to attack Zhejiang and Shanghai. The first route army was commanded by Gong Bangduo, who would be mainly attacking Shanghai. The second route army was led by Chen Taoyuan, who would be mainly defending Yixing, and the third route army was led by Wang Pu, who would be mainly attacking Guangdu of Zhejiang. In addition to all of this, Sun Chuanfeng, with support from Cai Shengxun, the governor of Jiangxi, organized the Fujian-Jiangxi alliance at Jianou. He would be attacking Zhejiang also, but his ambitions were much larger than just helping Qi Shiyuan. The Anway clique warlords knew that if Zhejiang and Shanghai fell to the Zhuli clique, the Anway clique was all but done for. Thus, many of them, such as Shi Shizheng, Wu Guangxin, Ma Lang, and Ku Tongfeng, began recruiting to fight for Zhejiang. Liu Yongxiang welcomed their help and he asked them to send word to the Fengtian clique for additional aid. Dr. Sun Yat-sen also said if war broke out between Jiangsu and Zhejiang, he would try to send forces of his Northern Expedition Army. By August of 1924, Sun Chuanfeng had moved his troops directly over to the Fujian-Zhejiang border. At 10 a.m. on September the 3rd of 1924, the first shot of Jiangsu-Zhejiang War rang around Yixing of Jiangsu province. The Jiangsu forces originally sought to capture Jiangxing in Zhejiang in one lightning attack, but they found extremely strong resistance. Zhejiang artillery in the mountains surrounding Jiangxing, around 30 miles from Yixing, kept them at bay, causing an immediate stalemate. By 11 a.m., the fighting made its way along the Shanghai-Nanjing Railway. By 10 a.m. the next day, the Jiangsu forces at Hongdu began firing at Zhejiang fortifications, but the Zhejiang defenders did not fire back. Lured in by the idea the fortifications might be unguarded, the Jiangsu forces came over only to be gunned down by machine guns and artillery, killing possibly hundreds of them. The Zhejiang fighters stormed out of their fortifications to pursue the enemy, and by 5 p.m., they captured Anqing in the process. Now, on the political side of things, because Qi Shi Huang launched the first punch, Liu Yangxian proclaimed that he was only defending his territory. Qi Shi Huang then, in the meantime, proclaimed he was working under Cao Kun. Thus, Liu Yangxian began tossing accusations at Cao Kun about his bribery scandal, calling him a treacherous dog. You know, the normal stuff. Now, all of this Cao Kun shit-talking prompted Cao Kun to issue official orders on September the 4th to attack Zhejiang province. I won't be getting into it here, but this sparked the Second Zhuli-Fengtian War, essentially. So while the focus right now is on the smaller war, there is a bigger war going on. Don't forget about that bigger war. Now, by September the 5th, the Jiangsu-Zhejiang War saw battles going on in 5 directions: Yixing, Shanghai, Nanjing, Jiading, Liuhe, Qingpu. Within the Yixing battles, the Jiangsu forces were initially blocked, facing Zhejiang counterattacks roughly 10 miles away from Yixing. The Jiangsu forces were battered. 3 battalions defected on the 6th. On the 7th, the Zhejiang forces entered Xushan, prompting Qi Shi Huang to mobilize the Anway 5th Mixed Brigade to reinforce the area, finally halting the Zhejiang advance. Another stalemate emerged, now between Xushan and Yixing. Over at the Shanghai-Nanjing Railway line area, after 2 quiet days, on the night of the 6th, the 2 armies clashed around Anqing. Both sides were evenly matched, forming a quick stalemate. In the Jiading area, on the night of the 3rd, the Jiangsu stormed the west gate of Jiading. The defenders were barely holding on. Liu Yangxian deployed Yang Huajiao's army, who made it over to the 5th. Both sides fought fiercely for days. Over in the Liaohe direction, during the afternoon of the 4th, Jiangsu forces advanced, but the Zhejiang artillery kept them at bay. By 5 p.m., however, the Zhejiang defenders were overwhelmed, allowing the Jiangsu forces to seize Liaohe as the defenders fled to Liaodian. At 3 a.m. on the 5th, the Jiangsu forces continued their advance, only to see the Zhejiang forces circle back and recapture Liaohe. The Jiangsu forces tossed numerous counterattacks, but they were repelled and forced to pull back to their start lines. Over in the Qingpu area, on the 5th, the Jiangsu forces divided themselves into 2 groups departing Anqing. One group attacked Xiport, only 6 miles away from Anqing. The other group attacked Beihe, due southwest. By 3 p.m. on the 6th, both sides were fighting, around Gongjai, just 10 miles north of Qingpu. The Zhejiang managed to halt the Jiangsu forces. Thus, after a few days, across pretty much all the battle areas, there was not much significant progress being made by either side. Just as it looked like the stalemate would not break, on the 8th, Sun Quanfeng's Jiangsu Fujian forces attacked. They quickly occupied Xiansha, Jiangshan, and Kuzhou. By the 18th, Liu Yangxian saw the enemy closing in around Shanghai, and he panicked. He knew, combined, these forces could launch 2-pronged attacks and just overwhelm him. Thus, Liu Yangxian sacrificed Zhejiang province as a whole, and he withdrew to Shanghai with his most elite forces. Now leaderless, the rest of the Zhejiang army was simply blown away by the Jiangsu Fujian forces. They quickly seized Jiading, Jiangxing, and other cities. The Jiangsu Navy then began bombarding coastal and riverside towns as their air forces bombed them as well. Facing a 3-dimensional war, the Zhejiang forces, they simply crumbled. By the end of September, the Zhejiang defense ceased. The Fujian Jiangsu armies rushed to Shanghai, occupying Jinqianwei, Songjiang, Qingpu, and Longhua by October the 13th. At that point, Liu Yangxian realized that he could no longer hope to hold Shanghai, so he alongside some other warlords fled into the Shanghai International Concession. The rest of the Zhejiang forces fell to Xu Shizheng, who was placed under house arrest. Thus, Qi Shi Huang and Sun Quanfeng were victorious. The war between the Jiangsu and Zhejiang forces lasted roughly 40 days. It was a tremendous disaster for the common people who resided in both provinces, who became quickly displaced. The Jiangsu Provincial Peasants Association relayed this message after the war to the State Council. In the war between Jiangsu-Zhejiang, the army passed by, the villages and towns were in ruins, the people were migrating, and they were unemployed. The rich were poor, and the poor were dead. No one knows how many people died in the war zones around Jiangnan and Yixing. This is especially true in Kunshan, Jiaoding, Caitang, Songjiang, Qingpu, and other counties. The Jiaoding, Qingpu, Songjiang, and Taokang associations added this to the State Council. The war broke out in Jiangsu and Zhejiang, and the two provinces were severely affected. In Jiangsu, the four counties of Jiaoding, Qingpu, Songjiang, and Caitang were most severely affected. Entire towns were destroyed, robbed, or displaced, and the situation was inexplicable. In short, the businesses stopped and the farmers fled. In the past 60 years, their vitality has been exhausted. Lastly, the Liaohe War Disaster Relief Association wrote this special report to the Ministry of Internal Affairs. The Jiangsu and Zhejiang provinces used the Liaohe River as a battlefield, and the stalemate lasted for 40 days and nights. People's lives and property were destroyed by artillery fire, and they were repeatedly raped and plundered. The Navy also fired long-distance artillery from time to time. Therefore, many houses were burned and bombed, such as schools, temples, shops, churches, charity halls, hospitals, and long-distance buses, which were all destroyed by the soldiers. A total of 154 houses in the city were destroyed by artillery fire. Of the 1,529 houses, about 3,300 were damaged by shells, and the total damage was estimated to be over 700,070 yuan. The merchants and civilians in the houses were not affected by this war disaster. For this reason, the residents were exiled, and their houses were no longer available, and they were unable to resume operations. The situation was so miserable that it was difficult for them to do so. Both sides' casualty figures ranged in the thousands to 10,000s. Official reports stated 30,000 total casualties for this war, with hundreds dying each day of it. However, the greatest harm fell upon the civilians. Young recruits, often having not been paid for long periods of time, resorted to looting and robbing. Civilians panicked and they fled their homes. Women were pressed into service as cooks and in brothels, known sometimes as public wives. Civilians were forced to work for the soldiers, performing things like transporting ammunition, digging trenches, and such. They were beaten with gun handles if they did not comply. Those who ran were whipped, many were shot. Gang rape was an epidemic. There was a tragic story of an 8-year-old girl and a 78-year-old woman who were gang raped to death by 13 soldiers near Fangcai while they were out picking cotton. Waves of refugees roamed the region. Japanese surveys indicated the Shanghai International Concession ballooned with 500,000 refugees. When Liu Yongxian fled for Shanghai, his Zhejiang army simply looted their own province. Economic losses were also insanely high. These losses came from warlords extorting or expropriating to meet military demands. It was estimated that the military expenditure of both sides was 60 to 70 million yuan. Neither provincial taxes could support such numbers, so the warlords forced banks and governments to allocate things like treasury exchange coupons. Sun Quanfang extorted 800,000 yuan from Hangzhou banks, and would later extort another 1 million yuan from the Shanghai business community. Soldiers burned, they killed, and they looted, as was the norm of warlord-era China. As you can imagine, the government bond price plummeted from all of this. Banks foreclosed, financial ruin ensued. The entire financial industry of Jiangsu and Zhejiang went on strike because of the war, and all of this, of course, impacted China's overall economy. Now, as I alluded to, the Jiangsu-Zhejiang War was not the only war fought over the two provinces in southeast China, but rather a contest between the entire Zhuli clique against an emerging anti-Zhuli coalition. It was another disastrous blow to an already dramatically weakened Anway clique, who pretty much would never recover. From this point forward, the Anway clique would not wield much presence politically or militarily. Although the war was clearly limited in scope to the southeast corner of China, it had an enormous impact across the nation. At the time, the Zhuli clique was in firm control over Beijing and was vigorously trying to unify China by force. threatening all other cliques' warlords. Yu Yongxiang desperately looked for anyone to help him out, even turning to Tao Qin and Wu Peifu, asking them to restrain Qi Xieyuan. Now, of course, neither Zhuli clique leader heeded this, as they wanted Zhejiang to fall into the Zhuli pocket. But they had no idea what a powder keg Zhejiang province would turn out to be. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there, I'm releasing a series on the Japanese invasion of North China and Inner Mongolia. But if you prefer your content to be in only audio, check it out at the Pacific War channel on any podcast platform. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for what I'll tackle next. The First Jiangsu-Zhejiang War was but a mere cog in a larger war that was unfolding across China. The warlord era was simply one battle to the next, as the warlords fought to unify China in their own little special image. But of course, the common people of China were always the ones who were going to pay the price.